Good afternoon. Boilerplate disclaimer up here on slide 1. We'll just forward through here. NIST defines resilience as the ability to anticipate, withstand, recover from, and adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks, or compromises on systems that use or are enabled by cyber resources. And it is towards this definition of resilience that we are orienting our conversation this afternoon. Sophisticated ransomware attacks like those on Baltimore in 2019 and Suffolk County, New York in 2022 rendered governments unable to provide basic services, collect revenue, and issue the routine authorities that keep municipal and regional government functioning. Cyber attacks by APTs conducted against government critical infrastructure expose and steal sensitive data, disrupt industrial control systems, and wreak havoc on basic services such as water, power, and heat. Ukraine faces an unprecedented barrage of attacks from multiple APTs, deploying a range of novel TTPs. The nation's ability to withstand these attacks and recover smartly from successful attacks bears compelling lessons for the global InfoSec community. And this is what we'll spend some time examining this afternoon with our panelists. Nazar Timorchik is a PhD and a seasoned cybersecurity professional with over 22 years of experience in enterprise security. He specializes in cyber defense, particularly in incident response and post-breach recovery, blue and purple teaming. As Chief Technology Officer of CERT UA, he specializes in incident response, intrusion research, and threat hunting, tracking adversary behaviors and intrusions by various APTs. Maxim Darkin serves as the Digital Development Advisor for USAID Ukraine, focusing on cybersecurity, anti-corruption, and digital governance. He plays a pivotal role in implementation of the Cybersecurity for Critical Infrastructure Ukraine, or CCI initiative, which seeks to enhance Ukraine's resilience against cyber threats by fostering collaboration across government, academia, private sector, and civil society. I'll be your moderator this afternoon. My name is Douglas White. I presently serve as Technical Director for the USAID Cybersecurity for Critical Infrastructure Initiative implemented by DAI. I've been with the project since 2021. Prior to my engagement with USAID, I initiated U.S. Department of State cybersecurity capacity building programs in Ukraine beginning in 2018. I've spent considerable time in Ukraine over this period, developing strategic partnerships and beneficiary relationships with government of Ukraine agencies, technical universities, and private sector players. As we look at the first part of our discussion, Maxim, in terms of anticipating, can you provide some background on the history of Russian cyber warfare against Ukraine leading up to the full-scale invasion of February 22? Begin with some background on the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the 2015 and 2016 attacks on the energy sector, and 2017's NotPetya.
That's a packed question. Good day, everyone. USAID has a sort of starting before answering the question. USAID's been in cybersecurity for not too long time, and so we've started focusing more at Ukraine's mission 2020, but prior to 2020, prior the attack in the invasion in 2022, I guess the remarkable points in Ukraine's history of cyber attacks also connected to political developments of the state and Russia's relations with Ukraine. One of the the starting point is 2010, up to 2013, when espionage was the order of the day for cybersecurity for cyber attacks on Ukraine, and trying to steal information and use it for the benefit of planning ahead of things on the ground or maybe in the political domain. 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, it started to show the interlink of the cyber attacks to military operations when the Crimea was annexed by Russia, and then Russians start tampering with the cable network going up to Peninsula, and then sort of, there's more or less correlation as to the military objective of seizing territories. 2015 and 16, as you referred, is probably everyone in the room is aware of the successful attack on the energy sector in Ukraine, leading to blackout and thousands of people being left for several hours without electricity. My colleague from CERT-UA can definitely talk more on the technical part of that. But to a development organization, like you say, that would mean, we have to get more serious about what is it, how cyber attacks can sort of hinder the development objectives of the mission. 2017, also a global phenomenon, if you want to call it that way, is when not only Ukraine suffered, but NotPetya attack kind of affected many countries and the companies and pretty much livelihood of many people, leading to, as you know, billions of money being sort of wasted and lost, and then 2021, sort of in preparation for invasion. I think this is where kind of things got very serious in terms of interlinkages between the military operations and then the sort of cyber warfare that was already happening on a large scale for Ukraine. The sophistication of the attacks and the interlinking them to the political objectives of Russia to sort of diminish the Ukrainian state is where I think, we can lead to that discussion later on. But that would be an overview of, evolution of the cybersecurity situation in Ukraine.
Thanks, Max. Nazar, what were some of the challenges faced in anticipating the scale and the scope of the cyber attacks that were forthcoming at that point in early 22?
Thank you for the question, Douglas. First of all, thank you everyone for being here with us and inviting us to give us this opportunity to share our experience. 2022 wasn't, beginning of the year was quite interesting, but it was just a further development of the things that happened earlier mentioned by Maxim. And we are luckily or unfortunately located in this place where we are at the bottom, cyber on the cutting edge of the cyber battlefield. We are a test ground for Russians, but many others also learning from us. And the thing is, once I was asked, on the conference, what is unique about your experience? Because U.S. is also attacked, Canada is attacked, German hospitals are paralyzed, we all face the same, but there is a minor difference. In the cyber criminals ecosystem, they are going after the money. Their motivation is different. During the war time, cyber is used differently. It's used to create real damage, to kill real people. That's why it's that critical. On the other hand, we have this previous experience since 2014, 2010, when they were constantly attacking us, where their APTs, most of their primary APTs were focused on us, while only the SVR, our APT-29, was focused primarily outside. So we were accumulating most of their attention. And before the war began, it was that epic moment when it was a magnetic interest to get as much as possible to many organizations, to have a persistence there, to have implants there, and it was really exciting to discover that some of these implants have been there for years, not being discovered. So uniqueness of our situation is that cyber is like a box. You can sit in your chair, watch box on the screen, and you understand what's going on there. You maybe get wet when you see how boxers are operating there, but you are not get punched in the face. You don't get that practical skill, avoiding these kicks. While like we are like for this 10 years in that ring, and with the enemy who is like way bigger than us. They are bigger in the manpower. They are different from their culture. The EPT on the east, EPT, like on the west, and they have like different culture doing their cyber operations. Someone trying to be, hidden and avoid detection. Russians are different. They are willed. If they do something, they, trying to prove that, hey, it was us. And we have an evidence for that, and the whole world should know that we succeeded in it. It's good for the world to learn from it. On the other hand, there are, malicious actors who are, always showing what they do, and there is actors who do it very professionally, and people don't even know that there is a breach for years. So we have been punched for 10 years in the face, and they are adopting, they are evolving all the time because they learned how we built our defense and constantly trying to evolve and bypass it. We have, fortunately, to US aid and support of all, US nation, the modern, the most, state-of-the-art technologies used across our government organizations. Still, they are succeeding, and they getting this unique experience from this situation and from breaching into these companies.
Thanks, Nazar. Maxim, how did the Ukrainian government and its cybersecurity experts prepare for the possibility of large-scale cyber war with Russia?
So this is, speaking again from the development perspective, the holistic approach to which, international organizations like USAID or, international community like Europeans support, sort of looking into not only providing technical capacity to third nation or third government in its ability to improve its operations, but they're looking at sort of holistic approaches to look into, changes in the policies, changes in the law, regulations, upskilling the workforce, and so the government of Ukraine, and as Nazar says, we've been punched for many years in the face, and sort of in boxing competition here that requires sort of a support and assistance. But that sort of experience already built up government of Ukraine capacity to retaliate the attacks to extent possible with the existing sort of tool set that colleagues here on the ground. What the government has achieved, and particularly since the 2020, exactly when cybersecurity project was sort of launched, is the creation of some at least a focal point within the government as the Vice Prime Minister and Minister of Digital Transformation role. Mikhailo Fedorov he came with the President Zelensky team, and built for the first time, the government had a separate ministry dedicated to digital transformation and responsible for sort of a coordinating cybersecurity actors on the ground within the establishment of the government. And so the preparation largely came in sort of building coordination among the stakeholders and the government side, and then U.S. government assistance and the European assistance going towards the upskilling of workforce, providing technical assistance to the extent possible with the software licenses that some of your companies may be making and that the government of Ukraine utilizes, and then hardware solutions that to replace the outdated equipment, and then legislation, building international linkages to like-minded nations and the alliance. One of the most recent one is the Tallinn mechanism, so-called Tallinn mechanism. Is a group of nations that mindful about cybersecurity across the board for Ukraine, is trying to build sort of like a momentum on the financial side and as well as on the political side to bring nations supporting Ukraine into sole purpose of getting the cybersecurity assistance and meeting the priorities of Ukraine in this challenging time. So I think that's the sort of maybe in a nutshell of how the government got to a point of where it is right now to retaliate the ongoing attacks.
Thank you. Nazar, we spoke earlier about the sort of evolution that you're seeing in some of the primary APTs that you track and are in the boxing ring against on a regular basis. Can you talk a little bit about the range of cyber and kinetic attacks, that combination, particularly those attack vectors used in combination, deployed against Ukraine from early 22 up until the present? Specifically, I'm referring to the January 2nd, 2024 barrage of 300 plus missiles and 200 plus drones striking Kharkiv, Kyiv, and the announcement by the SBU that uncovered 2 online surveillance cameras that had been hacked by Russian intelligence services to basically spy on the defense forces and conduct battle damage assessments using Ukrainian hardware in Ukrainian cities.
Thank you. That's a great question. Look, I joined CERT like from a private sector, and for me it was like absolutely novelty. Like some of my colleagues were publishing that there's missile strikes affiliated with cyber attacks. Like my mind, it was disconnected things. But when I started analyzing, digging further, and also collaboration with other colleagues, and seeing the even chats, Telegram chats, where like the Russian general, tasking the hacktivists APT to do the cyber attack against data center, while they do a missile strike. It was one of the big eye-opening, experiences. And further on, when you just take a timeline and see the, when you see the attack going on and when you see the timeline of missiles attacks against the peaceful cities, it's combined. A big discovery for myself was, that actually their military cyber ecosystem are very well connected and coordinated. So they are using the webcams to track the performance, of their kinetic operations. They use, cameras to track the logistics. So cyber is interesting component when you know how to cook it, how to deal with it, and we really see evolution, how they change, how they transform every 6 months. You can, I encourage everyone also to spare time and spend 10 minutes of your time to read CERT-UA and SSS CAP. You can open CAP.gov.ua, and there is report section. We produce a report where we give analytic of our discoveries and trends and see how they evolve. And the thing is that, in 2022, there were an old APTs who have been there for a while. Then in the next 6 months, a new APT start, appearing on the radars. In H1 2023, they changed their victimology, and victimology really matters because you understand how their tasking works, and you understand what is in the mind of their generals, what kind of missions they are trying to accomplish, how that mission is connected to the battlefield, or it's like some connected campaign to informational operation. So they really are cool combining effect operation with psychological operation with espionage operation. So they depending on who is the victim, where they manage to get into, and depending on the timeline, they can do the different effect and influence. As example, we see the trend that they are always active in attacking media, because in their thinking paradigm, through mass media you influence people, you spread chaos, you spread fear, and for whole 2022, like H1 2023, they are like obsessed with media. So like they are their way of building the brand of Russia is not just about destruction by action. They wanted everyone to know how big and strong they are and what they can do. So fear and spreading this chaos in society is their style, and you can track that this is their activity behind it. Not sure if I covered this question.
No, I think so. I think that covered it well. And that report is good reading. I spent some time with it last week. Nazar, it is publicly available, and after the program, if anyone is interested in a copy of it, contact Nazar or myself, and we'll give you the link. And we'll return to that report in a moment. I have many more questions than we have time, so I'm going to start condensing a little bit. Maxime, how did the donor community and USAID specifically respond to the full-scale invasion, and why? And can you speak to some of the IT security measures implemented by the Ukrainian government and its allies to contribute to sort of improving living conditions for the millions of Ukrainian civilians now finding themselves in a war?
Yeah, so biggest challenge was to kind of on a personal level to admit that Russia is going to invade your country. I mean, to me personally, like, being Ukrainian and sort of living with my kids and my wife in a country that's about to get hit by full presence of military that was staged on the border during 2021, kind of came sort of like a personal decision to make, acceptance of this is happening, and you wake up to a missile strike, and then your immediate reaction after months of everybody's talking about, some organizations start already making decisions on sort of leaving the country. It's kind of very difficult personal sort of experience, and so preparation to the the invasion was already happening on the ground before the invasion happened in February 2022. And so USAID provided, understanding sort of the linkage that Nazar is talking about, the communication channels and importance of communication in wartime. USAID was in United States State Department was sort of focusing on building communication backbone for Ukrainian government to operate, notwithstanding the attack on telecom sector or internet providers sort of or internet access. And so there's been challenge of bringing the alternative solutions into a country, And this is where we kind of start connecting to a Starlink sort of fleet, bringing a bunch of equipment of satellite technology to a country. In the meantime, building sort of clouds solutions for some of the registries, government registries, to move them out of the country. And that was before the invasion happened. So there's some preparations were already in place to to protect the vital services. And so why it's important in terms of Ukraine is currently, before the war, was already becoming a phase of rapid digital transformation, bringing more and more services online for government, for citizens to benefit from sort of the use of technology for the benefit, again, of anti-corruption, or just a user-friendly access to services, so that you don't have to wait in long lines or pay the bribe to get a service. I mean, digital was, and still is, sort of a partially response to that. And so keeping these digital tools online at all times, which did happen even after the invasion. Like we have this State on the Smartphone app that provides the access to your documents, and so many people fleeing the invasion were still being able to use the digital passports that Ukraine just launched before the invasion, in order to get the authorization to cross the border, or being checked at the checkpoints as people were sort of moving towards the west. And so keeping those documents operational would require cybersecurity solutions to ensure that the registry get intact. It even required at some point, I think you and I were working on the purchasing gasoline for generators to run the to run the registry during the blackout. So blackout is there, people don't have access sort of like to services on the ground. You purchase the generator to ignite the registry operation, and then at some point you need to even provide a gasoline, because that was a shortage of gasoline in the initial sort of months of the invasion. And so it's a full architecture that requires for cyber even to exist. If you don't have electricity, you don't have cyber problem. But at the same time, that helps to sustain the public trust in the government. If government can reliably provide access to services and address the emergent need of the population, then there is a support. And so I think Russia's been trying to play with that in order to destabilize the situation on the ground. So again, community came in, USA and others have sort of came in to support all aspects, from energy supplies to cyber solutions, licenses and hardware, again, to support the government and people.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the irony is that Ministry of Digital Transformation and the DIA application were so successful in creating a strong product that became relatively indispensable pretty quickly, that made it much more of a target for Russian aggression. And yet at the same time, there were parts that were indispensable. My understanding is shortly after the full-scale invasion, it was sort of 2-3 million Ukrainian refugees making their way to Europe, and I think the Polish government was actually able to distribute benefits to Ukrainians using the DIA app, if I recall correctly at the time.
Yeah, the initial weeks of sort of large number of people crossing the border, this is where Polish side accepted sort of the digital documents that Ukraine at that time was already kind of put in law as equal to your paper documents. Mm-hmm. And that was that's one of the great examples of when digital can actually address the emergency situations on the ground. And, mm-hmm. and even right now, many services still sort of depend on digital, or at least has moved to a digital sphere to that connect to the war, like, you know, recovery of your destroyed building can be easily done online using your mobile phone, actually, and so kind of eliminating or preventing people from accessing those services would dramatically sort of put a stress on the you know, society, and, you know, leading to some political challenges as well.
Certainly.
So yeah.
Thanks, Maxime. Nazar, we talked, and you've spoken already in the session about the sort of targeting selection by Russian state actors and the evolution of that targeting over time during the war, and what trends you've observed. I wanted to look at that in a little bit more detail in terms of your learnings in sort of mitigating threats against enterprises and defending digital estates against these types of threats. So sort of to that end, you spoke with me earlier when we first gathered about a month ago about the issue of the October 2023 U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission charges against the SolarWinds Corporation and its then CISO, Timothy Brown. Briefly, the SEC complaint alleges that Brown engaged in fraud and internal control failures related to allegedly known cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities. Brown, for his part, countered that from 2018 to 2020, before he was named CISO and before the SolarWinds discovered the Sunburst attack, that Brown had written multiple private memos to company executives and others expressing his concern about SolarWinds' cybersecurity posture. He said in 2018 that the company's current state of cybersecurity leaves us very vulnerable for our critical assets. And then 30 current and former CISOs said in their own amicus brief filed in February that the alleged inadequacies in SolarWinds' public filings are not typically the responsibility of CISOs, and that pinning the liability for them on Brown is sort of counterproductive. So here we have a situation where we have an employee who raised these risks to his executives as a concern. The company was then later targeted by the Russian GRU's APT-28, one of the world's premier threat actors, with the Sunburst attack on the Orion platform. But these executives didn't respond adequately to the risks highlighted by Mr. Brown, and SolarWinds suffered one of the worst supply chain attacks in history. So you and the team at CertUA, you see these guys, APT-28, every day. In the audience today, we have people who are probably quite familiar with this attack and familiar with the network support and other platforms in the supply chain. People who have the responsibility to secure their platforms against such malicious code inserts. So as an officer in a national CERT, what observations and advice can you offer to some of the audience gathered here today based on your experience?
Thank you. I wanted to, repeat the thing that Maxim mentioned on the beginning of previous section. He mentioned about coordination and communication. One of the, my recommendation number one is coordination and communication. This is a problem like people haven't solved even with ChatGPT. You see it with your families, your wife, your kids, and so on. And it's still still active in your teams. So my recommendation number one is to try to do the tabletop exercises with your teams. Try to build that trust with your teams to let them wear the glasses of malicious actor and to look at your organization from this perspective. Because one of the big problems we discovered is that when you came to the organization who was a victim of cyber attack and you ask them what kind of sensitive data are you processing, storing, or having transit, why they hacked you, most of the businesses, commercial sectors or government organization do not know. And most of CISOs with their security engineers also do not know where the users are storing or processing the valuable data. What valuable data can be used by national state threat actor or a commercial like cyber criminals. This is a thing that really matters in our reality, in our experience, because if you understand who is processing what, where and where, you understand what was the intention, why that victim was selected, and coordinating with the rest of your team will help you to recover, better, to have written down the emails to your other stakeholders, so you don't invent the wheel when the worst case scenario happened to your organization or country or whatever, but you are ready. So the resiliency begins with coordination inside your small group. As soon as you have that, you have the main thing. You understand what are your weakest spots, what can be the main target objective of this in your business, and you can then build these controls to make sure that it will be harder for them to sneak in undetected.
Thanks, Nazar. I'm going to follow up with one question to you, and then we'll end up with Maxime, as we're running a little bit short on time here. But I did want to get back to the report that you mentioned. A point that you highlighted in the State Service for Special Communication and Information Protections report is an observation of an uptick in sophistication of APT attacks, and that this may indicate an influx of new talent. Can you comment on that and also speak to what that may mean in a post-war environment with a Russian state equipped with these resources and capabilities, Russia aligned with Iran and China, and highly leveraged from a debt perspective by China?
Again, practical experience matters. Like the guys who have been practicing this, operations for 6 months, a year, 2 years, they will not disappear. They already have their blood on their teeth, and they will continue to do, because for them it is joy, and they have this permit to do it from their government. So what do they do next? They will focus to the wider scope with more targets, more opportunities, and what we also see as a changing pattern over quarter over quarter, half year, and every half year, these new threat actors they behave differently from the old one. As example, in this, in 2024 H1, we see the trend shifting from hacking into organizations to hacking into specific identities, specific signal charts, specific people. So they have, Russians collected a lot of PII data, and they, when they are crafting their messaging there, they are creating this unique, let's say, it's customer experience, the term, right? And there is a victim experience. So you their messages are crafted with injected PI details that no one else should know. So it seems like a legitimate request from the government agency. So they experiment a lot and learning what works. If something works well, they scale it up, and other nations also learning from it, and also trying to repeat the trick that works well for them, that it will be successful on a scale.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we spoke about briefly yesterday was sort of these capacities that have been built today. Once you pointed out to me that the number and the level of talent in APT 29, which is the SVR, which is mostly what we would see outside of Ukraine, that's a limited capacity, and there aren't that many of them. But APT 28 is sort of stocked with talent and stocked with bodies, and once we get to the situation where APT 28 is no longer focusing on Ukraine, that you will see some of those APT players focused on
There's
other
APT
targets.
24 and many others that even don't have an official title, but they exist, and they are like way more creative in what they do than the old-fashioned guys.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Max, we'll wrap up with you here so that we have time for Q&A. What have you learned about the role of U.S. and international foreign assistance in building cybersecurity and capacity building among allies, and what different approaches are you advocating for going forward based on what you've learned?
Thanks. I guess the main point here is never to let go of the momentum of support, which at least U.S. government has been really vocal about in keeping focus on Ukraine and assistance to Ukraine in the most difficult times. It's very, I think it's a human nature that initial few weeks or months everyone kind of support Ukraine, go about. You can find in any airport that you find in a bunch of journals and magazines sort of that discuss the horrific tragedy that is happening with the country. And then it kind of waters away in time, because keeping focus in our modern societies is really difficult. But this is important point here, is that we keep focusing on what's happening in the country right now, because it's a sort of a challenge that's going to be for other countries if these dominoes fall. What I've learned personally is that the building alliance is the most difficult part, and keeping sort of that focus on. And then important part, and I think we've discussed this with Nazar before, is learning curve. Keeping skilled workforce, as a great example of Russia is investing a lot in its cyber operations, and the recent attacks that we've observed more significant and more sophisticated than before. And that means Russians investing a lot in this. I think Ukraine needs that continued support in terms of sharing knowledge and skill sets with other nations as we struggle through this conflict, through the war. So I think collaboration, again, definitely is an asset here. Sharing information, State Service for Special Communication Information Protection is closely collaborating with multiple stakeholders, including the United States CISA organization, on exchanging practices and sort of threats that's being discovered in Ukraine with others, and that's definitely an asset that we provide to the world as a result of this conflict.
Thank you.
I guess those slides.
I neglected to get to this slide earlier, but just a reminder, this is Nazar's office. So while this isn't a typical day at the office, this is after missile strikes. I guess that was fall of 22.
That was a drone, right?
And
Drone strike?
even more interesting is that they in the Telegram, because they are so extroversial, let's say this way, they are really making we are like painful for them, because as a CERT we are more like emergency. We are coming and helping companies to recover quickly. They are targeted our building. They are targeting media to hack the media and post the fake news about us failing to respond in time, or like not providing resources to the other victims. So like they really have this great combination of holistic campaigns against someone who is doing something right.
Thanks, Nazar. I just want to offer a brief comment in closing and see if we do have time for a brief Q&A. As a reminder, these views do not necessarily reflect those of DAI, USAID, or the government of Ukraine. Today, the 6th of May, is day 802 since the Russian government launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is the largest war in Europe since World War II. I've been working in Ukraine and with Ukrainians for over 5 years. I know a lot of Ukrainians. Not one is untouched by this war, very directly. Millions are displaced. The civilian casualties are staggering. Everyone has buried a classmate, a colleague, a relative, a friend. These men who share the stage with me and their colleagues from the Ukrainian delegation that are here at the RSA conference, they'll return to Kyiv shortly, where they face air raid alerts nightly and hear news of profound violence levied against their country daily. As we sit here at this moment, there are tens of thousands of young men and women in harm's way, up to their knees in mud and sleeping in trenches. There are children attending school in underground bunkers as a measure against indiscriminate missile strikes. These sacrifices do not escape our notice, our compassion, nor our deepest respect. It is my most sincere hope that my compatriots and my government recognize our obligation to remain steadfast in our commitment as allies for as long as it takes. Indeed, I know I speak for my compatriots when I say there are many here who acknowledge and mark well the notion that your fight for your nation's sovereignty and for your way of life is a fight for the very same values that we hold dear in this country. Вічна пам'ять загиблим і слава Україні.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.